Hello and welcome to the Excel VBA Objects Series. In this video, we'll talk about the worksheet object. The worksheet object represents a single sheet or worksheet within the worksheets collection in a workbook. We can use VBA macros to automatically add worksheets or delete worksheets, to loop through worksheets, to copy-paste entire worksheets, and many more things. We can also use worksheet events to trigger a macro when a worksheet is activated or when we change the selection or we change the value in a worksheet. Let's see how to reference the worksheet object. We refer to the worksheets collection object simply with worksheets, and when I add the dot, we get the list of properties and methods for the worksheets collection object. And that's very similar to what we've seen in the previous video with the workbook object. So we can, for example, count the number of worksheets in a workbook, or we can add or delete a worksheet, etc. The count of worksheets in this workbook will return just one, as you see here, sheet 1. We refer to a single worksheet with worksheets, also with S, and the index or the name of the worksheet in parentheses. So if we write worksheets 1, this will refer to the first worksheet. Or we can use the name in parentheses. Then we would apply any properties or methods. In order to see that, we should refer directly to the object name of the worksheet. So in this case is sheet 1, and then we get the list of properties and methods for the worksheet object, which is different to the one we've seen for the worksheets collection object. And we can see the full list in the appendix of the Excel VBA Objects Guide. So as you see here, the sheets collection object and the worksheets collection object are very similar, or they actually share the same properties and methods. However, when we use the count property with the sheets object, that will count the worksheets and also the chart objects. On the other hand, the count property of the worksheets object will only count the number of worksheets. If we use the add method of the sheets object, it will give an option to specify what type of sheet. It could be a worksheet or a chart sheet. If we use the add method of the worksheets collection object, it will only add a worksheet. We can see the list of properties and methods for the worksheet object in this other page. And we can also see the worksheet events. Most of these also apply to the sheet object when working with a worksheet. Now, it's important to understand the notation Excel uses in the project window. As you see here, it says sheet 1 and in parentheses sheet 1. So the first is the object name and the second is the tab name here. So if I change, for example, here to data, now we have sheet 1 is still the same object name, but the name of the sheet now is data. So if we refer to sheet 1 and the user changes the name, it still works. However, if we use worksheets sheet 1, that will not work anymore because the name has changed. That would be now worksheets data. We can also change the worksheet object name here in the properties window. So it says sheet 1, I can say my sheet or whatever name you want to give. So either way has its own advantages and disadvantages. Now we need to say my sheet, and then we can apply any property or method. Let's say we activate the worksheet. And we can also refer to a sheet with active sheet, and that's of course the sheet which is active at that moment. We can use a variable to store the name of the sheet as a string. So that would be, for example, dim sheet name as a string. And then here, when using worksheets, instead of writing the name in quotations, here we could say sheet name. And then whatever property or method we want to use. But in the same way we've seen with the workbook object, we often use object variables to work with worksheet objects. So for example, we could declare a variable called WS as a worksheet in singular. And then we could set WS as the active sheet, for example, or we can, of course, specify any particular worksheet. In this case, we only have one, which is called data. And then we can apply any properties or methods using that object variable. This is very helpful when working with more than one worksheet. For example, when we want to copy data from one worksheet to another, then we would use WS1 and WS2 as a worksheet and specify which one is which. And then do the operations that we want to do with one or the other or both. And if the worksheets are in different workbooks, we would refer to the workbooks as we saw in the previous video. So similarly, we could declare a workbook object variable and then set WB1 to whatever workbook, let's say this workbook, and then we could say this WS1 worksheet is in the first workbook, WB1, and worksheets data. So check the previous video about the workbook object if you get confused with all of that. We can select one or more worksheets, but we can only activate one. And we do that simply with worksheets, the worksheet index or name, and select if we want to select that particular worksheet or activate. In this case, the result is the same. But when we have more than one worksheet, we can select more than one using the array function. So that would be an array of the first worksheet we have here is data, and we don't have any other worksheet now, but let's say we would have sheet 2, and we could select the two worksheets at the same time. When both sheets are selected, any changes to one of them replicates in the other. But now let's see how to add a new worksheet. So we simply use the add method of the worksheets collection object. Now, when we add a space here, we get several options. We can specify before which worksheet we want to add the new worksheet or after which worksheet. We can also specify the number of worksheets we want to add and the type of worksheet. So let's say I want to add it after whatever the active sheet is. Let me comment this. Now if we run this, as you see, we have a new worksheet after the active sheet that was data. And the default name is sheet 1. So by default, Excel gives that name sheet 1, sheet 2, sheet 3, etc. When adding a worksheet, that becomes the active sheet. So we can now say active sheet.name and change the name of a worksheet. Let's say results. But we can actually do all that in one shot. So worksheets.add.name equals results. That would add, let's comment this now, that would add a new sheet, and in this case we didn't specify after or before, so it will just be before the active sheet. That's by default is gonna put it before the active sheet. So if we run the macro, now we get a new sheet before the active sheet that was sheet 2 with already the name results. If we want to add a worksheet in the first position, we would do something like worksheets add before worksheets 1. And as you see, it has added the fourth worksheet, sheet 4 by default, before on the first position, so before the first worksheet. And if we want to add the worksheet at the end, so the last worksheet, that would be after worksheets count. Let's run it. And as you see now, we have the 5th worksheet at the end. And as I mentioned earlier, we could actually use the Sheets object to add a new worksheet as well. That works exactly the same way, with the peculiarity that we could specify the type of a sheet and add a chart sheet instead. And we can actually also refer to a worksheet with sheets. I didn't mention that here, but let me add a new line here. So we could also say sheets and data, and that would refer to that worksheet. Now, you may not have used chart sheets that much, and probably you've used embedded charts, but if you come here and you say insert, you have the possibility to insert a chart, but that's a chart sheet, right? That's not an embedded chart. So now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 worksheets and 1 chart sheet. So if we use the count property for worksheets and we put that into a message box, and let me comment that, you see we get 5. There are 5 worksheets, but if instead of worksheets we use sheets, now we get 6, because that's the total of sheets, worksheets plus chart sheets. We're going to have a separate video to talk about the chart object. So now let's continue talking about the worksheet object. We can also delete a worksheet specifying the index or the name with delete. If I run that, we have deleted the data worksheet. Now let's see how to copy and paste worksheets. And for that, I'm going to copy here some data from other workbook. Into this tab. And let's delete the other worksheets to clean up a little the workbook. So let me go back here. If we want to delete several worksheets, we need to loop for each WS, for example, in worksheets, and then next WS, and here we're going to say WS delete. So this is going to delete every worksheet in the workbook, but it will prompt an error because we cannot delete every worksheet. We need to leave one, and we're going to leave sales. So I will just put a condition here, is that if the name is different than sales, then we are going to delete. So if I run, and let me comment that. If I run this code now, you see it has deleted all the worksheets, not the chart sheet. We would also delete the chart sheet if we write sheets here. Okay, but I'm just going to delete it manually. And when doing that manually, it prompts this warning message. So I'm also going to change the worksheet object name. So let's put sheet 1 again. So now if we want to copy that sheet, as you see, when we enter a space, it gives the two possibilities. We can copy the sheet before other sheet or after a particular sheet. Now, if we don't specify a particular sheet, it will actually add a new workbook and copy the entire sheet to a totally new workbook. So let's run this and see what happens. As you see, it has created a new workbook. That's book 2 here. And I've closed the other workbook, so we have only book 1 and book 2. And we could do the same operation with worksheets and the name of the worksheet, which is sales. Okay, so if we run the macro, now we add yet another workbook. It's book 3 with the same data as that worksheet. Okay, so let's close the workbooks for now, because we are not talking about the workbook object in this video. That was covered in the previous video. Now, if you want to copy that data in the same workbook, you need to specify after which worksheet. And in this case, we only have one, so it's going to be after the active sheet or after the worksheet sales. So if we say copy after the active sheet, now you see we have a new worksheet with the same name, but specifying it is the second version and the exact same data. But that's probably something we're not going to do. Instead, we may want to copy that sheet to other workbook. In that case, we need to specify again which workbook. So that would be workbooks book 1 worksheet sales copy, and then we would copy that into another workbook. Let's add a new workbook here, and that's book 4 now, because we were adding some workbooks before. There were book 2 and book 3. So now let's copy that to workbooks book 4. And remember, we are not specifying the extension here because these workbooks have not yet been saved. But otherwise, you would have to put here .xlsx, okay? And that was explained in the previous video as well. And then it's going to be after worksheets 1, for example. So if we run this, we have copied the worksheet, including the data and the name of the sheet, in another workbook. And as you see, it's the same data, the same name, and it has been added before the active sheet because we didn't specify where we want to put it. But usually we only copy a range of data or cells. In that case, we would add here, after workbooks and worksheets, we would add here cells. That would be copying all the cells, and we would copy that. Let's put that in the next line. We would copy that in the cells of the worksheets. And here we need to specify the worksheet. Let's say in worksheets 1 or sheet 1 is empty. So that will copy only the data, not the sheet name or the tab color or things like that. And as you see now, we have in sheet 1 the data. And instead of cells, we could specify a particular range, and that's what we do more often. Let's say we want to copy A1 to D4, and we want to paste that starting in A1. And if I remove the data here, and I run this again, you see it has copied only A1 to D4. But we are going to cover more about that in a separate video where we will talk about the range object. And there are many other interesting properties and methods of the worksheet object. As we've seen earlier, we can change the name of a worksheet. We can also change the tab color. For example, make it red. So let's close book 4 now. Now this will apply to sales. As you see, we have changed the name and we have changed the tab color. We can also refer to sheet 1, and here, for example, we can hide the worksheet. As you see, there are 3 options here when we use the visible property. And the first one is just hiding the worksheet as we would do it manually. The last one is making that visible again. And the very hidden is another level of hiding a worksheet which cannot be unhidden manually by the user, for example. It needs to be unhidden in the VBA editor or with VBA code. So let's do that, and let me comment this now and see how that looks like. So if you see, we have hidden that one, and if we click here, we cannot unhide it because it's very hidden. So let me change it just to hidden. Now if we go here, we have the possibility to unhide that manually. We can also use VBA to protect and unprotect a worksheet, and if we add a space here, we see the many different options we have. We can set a password, we can specify which components we want to protect. So for example, we can allow to delete columns or allow to use pivot tables, filtering, and many other possibilities. If we protect the sheet, and let me comment that too, we cannot change any cell that is locked. And you do that manually here under the Review tab. Now let's protect the sheet, but we can also do that with VBA using unprotect. And we can again use a password and specify any components that we want to protect. Now let's see what are worksheet events, and we have covered that earlier in introductory videos in this series. So we can use worksheet events for each particular worksheet. Just go into that worksheet module. So for example here, sheet 1 for new name worksheet, and then selecting worksheet on the left hand side and selecting one of the events in the drop down on the right hand side. And by default, as you see, we get the selection change event procedure. And that means that whatever code we write here will trigger when the selection is changed in this particular worksheet. So if I write a message box, selection has changed, and we just change the selection in the worksheet, it will pop up this message box. Some other useful worksheet events are probably the activate event. So that would trigger whenever we activate that sheet only. So we could have here message box, welcome to sheet 1, and that's not the name the user is going to see here, but we can change that in a moment. That's sheet 1 now, okay. And whenever we are in any other sheet and we go back to sheet 1, we're going to get that message box. Now instead of selection change, we can use also the change event procedure, this here. And this will trigger only when a value in that sheet changes. So let's delete this one and write a value has changed using the worksheet change event. So now here, if I change the selection, nothing happens because we have deleted that event. But if I change the price here, which doesn't make sense, but let's say I changed the price 75, there was a mistake, so it alerts a value has changed. So we could write any code when changing the value in that particular worksheet. Only in that sheet, of course. If we go to another sheet and we change anything, nothing happens because the event procedure only applies to sheet 1. Now, if we want that in sheet 2, then we double-click sheet 2 and do the same operation, right? So we can run a macro before deleting a sheet, or before the mouse double-click or right-click, when we calculate or when we deactivate the sheet, and when following a hyperlink in that sheet, etc., etc. So that was it about the worksheet object. In the next videos, we're going to talk about the worksheet function object, the range object, the chart, shapes. So stay tuned and thanks for watching.